Her finger was trembling as she pressed it against her lips. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated, screaming a silent message through the narrow gap in the shelving unit. "Don't drink it. Please don't drink it." The kitchen fell deadly silent. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to vanish. The man she was signaling didn't see the fear for what it was. He saw only a thief caught in his domain. But the man she was desperate to save was no ordinary victim. He was Ju Young-min, the most ruthless syndicate boss in the city, and he believed he was the predator in this room. He raised the glass to his lips, mocking her fear with a cold smile. And what happened the moment that water touched his tongue would not only shatter his arrogance, it would leave the most powerful man in the city paralyzed at the feet of the cleaning lady he just threatened to kill. It was a quiet Tuesday night in the heart of the city's culinary district, 2026. The stainless steel kitchen of the Obsidian gleamed under the overnight safety lights, smelling of lemon polish and sanitized order. This wasn't just a kitchen. This was Ju Young-min's sanctuary. Every chef knew the protocol. Every cleaner understood the unspoken rules. You left the surfaces spotless. You exited before 2 a.m., and you never, ever entered the kitchen when the boss came down for his nightly drink. Ju Young-min stood by the prep counter, a man whose tailored suit looked as sharp as the knives on the magnetic strip. At 38, now he had built an organization on a foundation of absolute discipline. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were predatory. He missed nothing. And tonight, like every night for the past 5 years, he was here for his ritual: silence, solitude, and a single glass of ice water. This was how Ju Young operated. Meticulous, untouchable. He had survived in the underworld because he understood one fundamental truth. Control is survival, and anyone who hid in the shadows was weak. But then, something happened that would turn his perfect control into his greatest vulnerability. He spotted a shadow in the shelving unit. He smiled, believing he had found a mouse to toy with. He didn't know that the real monster was standing in the pantry behind him, and that the water in his hand was already poisoned. Each the metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. Ju Young-min didn't look back at the door. He simply rested his hand on the brass knob for a second longer than necessary, ensuring the seal was absolute. He was a man who appreciated containment. Chaos was for the streets. The kitchen was for order. He turned slowly, his heels clicking rhythmically on the pristine white tiles as he approached the stainless steel shelving unit. Wendy stood pressed against the prep counter, her chest heaving in shallow, rapid gasps. She looked like a rabbit cornered by a wolf, her eyes wide and wet with terror. But Ju Hyung, blinded by his own legend, misread the room entirely. He thought she was trembling because of him. "You know," Ju Hyung began, his voice smooth and dangerously calm. My father used to say that curiosity is not a sin. It is a calculation. And you..." He paused, brushing a speck of dust from his tailored lapel. "You are very bad at math." Wendy didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat worked convulsively as she tried to force air into her lungs, but her gaze wasn't fixed on the man threatening her life. Her eyes were locked on the pantry door directly behind him, a heavy steel door that was currently ajar by less than an inch. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," Ju Hyung commanded softly, stepping into her personal space. The smell of expensive cologne and cold detachment rolled off him. Wendy shook her head violently, her hands coming up to cover her mouth, her finger pressing into her lips until the skin turned white. She pointed a trembling hand toward the pantry, her muffled whimpers rising in pitch. Ju Hyung chuckled, a low, humorless sound. He assumed she was begging for mercy, gesturing to the exit, looking for a way out that didn't exist. "There is no use panicking now. You chose to be here. You chose to see things that do not concern the cleaning staff. And in this world, we pay for what we take." He turned his back on her, dismissing her fear as insignificant. He walked toward the central island, where a crystal pitcher of water sat sweating in the humidity. He ran a finger down the condensation on the glass. "I'm going to have a drink," Ju Hyung said, lifting the pitcher. The ice shifted with a melodic chime. "And while I do, you are going to think very carefully about who sent you, Because if I don't like the answer... He let the threat hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. No, Wendy let out a strangled cry, her legs buckling as she watched him pour the water. She knew what was in the glass. She knew who was in the pantry. And she knew that the moment the king took his sip, the slaughter would begin. Ju-young smiled at his reflection in the fridge, raised the glass, and toasted the empty air. To consequences, he whispered. The water was crisp, painfully cold against his teeth. Ju-young drank slowly, letting the chill wash away the heat of the day. It tasted pure, distilled, expensive, perfect. He lowered the glass, the condensation slick against his palm, and looked at Wendy. He expected to see her breaking, perhaps falling to her knees to beg for her job or her life. Instead, she looked like she was witnessing a funeral. Now, Ju-hyung started, intending to ask for a name. Tell me. The words felt heavy in his mouth. His tongue seemed to swell, filling the cavity of his jaw like a sponge. He frowned, confused. He tried to clear his throat, but the muscles in his neck didn't respond. A strange vibration began in his fingertips, a pins and needles static that shot up his wrist and into his elbow. What is this? He thought, irritation flaring before panic could set in. Stress? Exhaustion? He tried to set the glass down on the counter, a simple movement he had performed 10,000 times. His brain sent the command. Extend arm. Release fingers. His arm remained frozen at his side. His fingers didn't just refuse to open. They ceased to exist in his sensory map. Gravity took over. The crystal tumbler slipped from his numb grip. The sound of the glass shattering on the tile was deafening, down like a chandelier dropping in a library. Shards of diamond-bright glass skittered across the floor, dancing around his polished shoes. Ju-hyung stared at the mess, furious at his own clumsiness. He tried to step back to avoid the debris. His legs were gone. The world tilted violently to the left. The white ceiling rushed down to meet him. He hit the floor hard, his shoulder absorbing the impact with a dull thud he barely felt. He lay there, rigid, a mannequin toppled in a store window. His lungs strained, fighting against a chest that felt like it was encased in concrete. He gasped, a wet, rattling sound escaping his lips. He was paralyzed, his eyes wide and frantic, locked onto Wendy. She hadn't moved. She hadn't run. She was still pressed against the counter, her hands clutching her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. But she wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the space directly above his head. The realization hit him harder than the floor, the trembling finger, the wide eyes, the desperate silence. She hadn't been begging him for mercy. She had been warning him. She wasn't scared of him. She was scared for him. Ju-young tried to scream, but only a bubble of saliva formed on his frozen lips. He was the king of the city, the man who commanded armies, and he was lying in broken glass, utterly helpless, waiting for the shadow behind him to move. The silence that followed the crash was broken by the soft, rhythmic squeak of leather hinges. From the periphery of Ju-hyung's frozen vision, the pantry door drifted open. A shadow lengthened across the white tiles, stretching until it touched Ju-hyung's cheek like a cold caress. At first came the shoes. Italian leather, oxblood, perfectly polished. Ju-hyung knew them. He had bought them for Kenji as a gift for his promotion last Christmas. Kenji stepped fully into the light. He didn't have a gun drawn. He didn't need one. He looked down at his mentor with an expression of mild curiosity, as if inspecting a piece of machinery that had finally broken down after years of rattling. He crouched, his expensive trousers straining slightly at the knees, bringing his face inches from Ju-young's. Neurotoxin, Kenji whispered, the word sounding like a secret shared between friends. It doesn't stop the heart immediately. It just disconnects the operator from the machine. Ju-hyung screamed inside his own skull, a primal roar of rage that manifested as nothing more than a wet glaze over his unblinking eyes. He tried to bite, wanted to thrash, to do anything, but he was a prisoner in his own skin. Kenji stood up and sighed, adjusting his cufflinks. He glanced over at Wendy, who was pressed so hard into the shelving unit, She looked like she was trying to merge with the steel. Kenji offered her a dismissive, almost pitying look. To him, she wasn't a threat. She was just a mess to clean up later. A witness who was already dead and didn't know it yet. "You should have kept hiding, little mouse," Kenji said to her, his voice bored. "Now you have to watch the butchery." He turned his attention back to the paralyzed king at his feet. He nudged Ju Yong's shoulder with the toe of his boot, rolling him slightly onto his back so he stared up at the harsh fluorescent lights. "You know your problem?" Kenji asked, walking casually toward the magnetic knife strip on the far wall. "You thought loyalty was a currency you could buy. You thought because you fed us, we wouldn't bite." Kenji reached out and selected a heavy, distinctively rectangular meat cleaver. The steel rasped against the magnet as he pulled it free. He tested the weight of it in his hand, the blade glinting under the safety lights. "But mostly," Kenji said, his back turned to them as he admired the edge, "you just always talk too much, boss." He began to turn around, the cleaver raised, ready to end the reign of Ju Hyung Min. But in his arrogance, he had made the same mistake Ju Hyung had. He had forgotten to count the variables in the room. He had turned his back on the cleaning lady. Fear usually freezes the blood, turning limbs to lead and breath to shallow hitches. But for Wendy, fear was a different chemical altogether. It was fuel. As Kenji admired the gleam of the cleaver, his back turned to the room. Wendy didn't look at the locked exit. She knew the deadbolt was thrown. She had heard the click herself. There was no way out. That left only one impossible option. She didn't sprint for the door. She exploded from the shelving unit, her sneakers squeaking sharply on the tile. The sound was loud, too loud, but she didn't care. She lunged not for freedom, but for the paralyzed man on the floor. Ju Young stared up at the ceiling, waiting for the blade, when suddenly the world jerked beneath him. He felt a violent tug at his throat as Wendy's hands bunched into the lapels of his Italian suit. She dug her heels into the grout, grit her teeth, and pulled. He was dead weight, 180 pounds of uncooperative mass. Wendy groaned, a guttural sound of pure exertion, more as she hauled him backward. Ju Hyung's polished shoes scraped across the tile, a sound like sandpaper on bone. To his frozen mind, the sensation was disorienting, a blur of motion he couldn't control. He watched the fluorescent lights streak overhead. "What are you doing?" his mind screamed. "Run, you idiot!" But she didn't let go. She dragged him a foot, then two, hauling him around the corner of the heavy stainless steel prep island just as Kenji began to pivot. The movement was a blur of frantic energy. Wendy threw her weight back, pulling Ju Hyung's torso behind the metal barrier, and collapsed on top of him, breathless. A split second later, the air hissed. Thwack! The cleaver came down, burying itself deep into the chopping block where Ju Young's head would have been if he were still visible. Kenji stood there, his arm extended, staring at the empty expanse of white tile. He blinked, the boredom vanishing from his face, replaced by a sharp, confused frown. "Huh," Kenji muttered, pulling the blade free from the wood with a wet suck. He looked around the empty kitchen, his eyes narrowing. The mouse hadn't just run. She had taken the cheese with her. Kenji didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply stood in the center of the kitchen, turning in a slow circle, the heavy cleaver resting casually against his thigh. He looked at the spot where Ju Young had fallen. A few stray shards of glass and a wet smear on the tile were the only evidence the king had ever been there. "Impressive," Kenji murmured, his voice echoing off the stainless steel. "I didn't think you had the upper body strength." He walked calmly to the heavy metal delivery door at the rear of the kitchen. He gave the handle a sharp tug. Locked. He then moved to the front entrance, the one Ju Young had bolted shut with such arrogance only minutes before. Kenji checked that one too. Secure. The kitchen was no longer a workspace. It was a sealed vault. "There's nowhere to go, Wendy," Kenji called out, his tone conversational, like a man asking a colleague for a stapler. "And he's heavy, isn't he? Dead weight is exhausting. How long before your arms give out? 2 minutes? 5? He began to walk down the main aisle, trailing the tip of the cleaver along the metal countertops. Screech! The sound was high-pitched and nauseating, designed to fray nerves. Come out, little mouse, leave him. I'll make it quick for you, I promise. Behind the thick island of the prep station, Ju-hyung lay contorted in the darkness. The paralysis had claimed everything below his neck, leaving him a prisoner in his own corpse-like body. His cheek was pressed against the cold floor, his field of vision limited to a 6-inch gap between the floor and the bottom of the cabinetry. He couldn't see Kenji. He could only hear the click-clack of the ox-blood leather shoes hunting him. What he could see were Wendy's sneakers. They were cheap white canvas shoes, scuffed gray at the toes and frayed at the laces. He had probably walked past those shoes 100 times in the hallways of his restaurant, never once looking up to see the face of the person wearing them. They were the shoes of someone who stood for 12 hours a day scrubbing his floors, someone invisible, someone he deemed beneath notice. Now those scuffed sneakers were the only things on earth that mattered. He watched Wendy's ankles tremble. She was crouching over him, shielding his body with her own, her breath coming in silent, terrified hitches. She held a heavy cast-iron skillet in one hand, her knuckles white. She wasn't leaving him. She wasn't taking Kenji's offer. Ju-hyung felt a sensation that cut through the numbness of the neurotoxin, a sharp, stinging humiliation. He had threatened to kill her. He had mocked her intelligence. And yet, here she was, standing guard over his helpless form, preparing to fight a killer with nothing but a frying pan and a pair of worn-out shoes. His life, his empire, his entire future now rested in the calloused hands of the woman he had tried to silence. The footsteps receded toward the walk-in freezers, buying them a handful of seconds. In the cramped darkness beneath the prep station, Wendy shifted her weight, wincing as her knee ground into the hard tile. She looked down at Ju-hyung. He was a statue, his face slack, his breathing shallow and rhythmic. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was already gone. Then his eyes moved. They snapped toward her, tracking her movement with a frantic intensity that betrayed the stillness of his body. There was no glaze of death there. There was only a screaming, trapped consciousness. Wendy leaned in, her face inches from his. She smelled of bleach and sweat. He smelled of neurotoxin and impending death. "Can you hear me?" she whispered, the sound barely audible over the hum of the compressors. Ju-hyung stared at her. He willed his mouth to open, to bark an order, to tell her to stop hovering. Nothing happened. "If you can hear me," Wendy murmured, while her eyes darting to the end of the counter to check for Kenji. "Blink once." Ju-hyung felt the dryness of his corneas. It took a supreme effort of will, a mental command that felt like lifting a boulder, but his eyelids fluttered shut for a second, then snapped open. Yes. Wendy let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Okay, you're in there. Listen to me. We need a way out. I can't carry you and fight him at the same time." She gripped his shoulder, her fingers digging into the expensive fabric of his suit. "I need to know. You're the boss. You have to have something, a weapon, a backup." Ju-hyung watched her pupils dilate. He saw the desperation. She was looking for a miracle. "Is there a gun?" she asked, her voice trembling with hope. "Do you have a gun on you? An ankle holster? Anything?" Ju-hyung stared at her. The irony was a bitter taste in his mind. He prided himself on civilized business. Weapons were for the enforcers, for the street soldiers, for people like Kenji. The king didn't carry a sword. He carried a checkbook. He had felt so safe in his own castle that he hadn't bothered to arm himself. He stared into Wendy's hopeful eyes. He blinked. Then he blinked again. No. Wendy's face fell. The hope drained out of her expression, leaving a stark, cold reality. She looked at his paralyzed hands, then at her own trembling fists. "Okay," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No gun, just us." She looked around the kitchen, her gaze landing on the shelves of chemical cleaners. "Then we have to get creative." "Stay here," Wendy whispered, the command absurd enough to be tragic. She squeezed Ju-hyung's paralyzed hand one last time, not for comfort, no, but to anchor herself, and then she let go. She slipped away from the shelter of the stainless steel island, moving on her hands and knees. The floor was cold and hard, biting into her skin. She kept her head low, below the sight line of the counters, moving with the practiced silence of someone who had spent years trying to be invisible. Across the kitchen, the screech of metal on metal stopped. Kenji had paused. "I can hear you breathing, Wendy." His voice drifted over the workstations, playful and terrifying. "Cardio is important, but you can't run forever in a locked room." Wendy froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She scanned the environment, her mind racing through a calculus of survival. She looked at the knife magnet on the far wall. Too far, and she had never held a weapon in her life. And Kenji would disarm her and gut her before she could even raise a blade. She looked at the heavy rolling pins. Too slow. She couldn't outfight him. She couldn't outmuscle a man who killed for a living. She had to outthink him. Her eyes landed on the utility rack near the dishwashing station. It was the one corner of the kitchen Joo-hyung never looked at, the place where the dirty work lived. There on the bottom shelf sat the tools of her trade, a gallon jug of industrial-strength bleach. Next to it, a yellow bottle of concentrated ammonia-based glass cleaner. Wendy stared at them, her breath catching. She remembered the safety training videos she was forced to watch when she was hired, the ones everyone else ignored. "Never mix these," the instructor had droned. "The reaction creates chloramine vapor. It burns the eyes. It destroys the lungs. It kills." It was a war crime in a plastic bottle. She crawled toward the rack, ignoring the trembling in her limbs. She reached out and grabbed the heavy white jug of bleach with her left hand and the ammonia with her right. They were heavy, sloshing dangerously as she lifted them. She wasn't a soldier, she was a cleaner, and she was about to sanitize the kitchen. Clutching the bottles to her chest, she turned back toward Joo-hyung. He was still lying there, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, a helpless king waiting for checkmate. Wendy grit her teeth. She didn't have a gun, but she had chemistry, and in a sealed room, chemistry was deadlier than a bullet. The game of cat and mouse had lost its novelty. Kenji stopped dragging the cleaver inside, the sound sharp in the quiet kitchen. He stood perfectly still, not tilting his head like a dog listening for a heartbeat. Then, with a decisive pivot, he walked straight toward the heavy prep island where Wendy had left the king. He didn't check the corners. He didn't look under the tables. He walked with the confidence of a man who knew exactly where the dead weight was hiding. From the shadows of the dishwashing station, Wendy watched in horror. She clutched the heavy jugs of bleach and ammonia against her chest, her knuckles aching. She was too far away. She watched Kenji round the corner of the island and looked down. "There you are," Kenji said, his voice dripping with mock relief. Joo-hyung lay helpless on the tiles. He saw Kenji loom over him, a dark silhouette blocking out the harsh fluorescent lights. Kenji tucked the cleaver into his belt and reached behind his back, withdrawing a matte black pistol with a suppressor screwed onto the barrel. He hadn't wanted to use it. Too loud, too messy, but he was tired of walking. "Nothing personal, boss," Kenji whispered, leveling the barrel at the center of Joo-hyung's forehead. "Actually, maybe it is a little personal." Joo-hyung stared into the black tunnel of the gun. He couldn't close his eyes. He couldn't look away. He could only watch his death approaching in slow motion. Wendy didn't think. She dropped the chemical jugs onto the rubber floor mat, silently, and grabbed a heavy stainless steel stockpot from the drying rack. With a guttural scream of effort, she hurled it across the kitchen. The pot tumbled through the air, flashing under the lights, and smashed into the metal shelving unit on the far wall with a deafening, chaotic, clang-rattle-crash. Kenji flinched. It was a reflex, born of instinct rather than thought. He spun toward the noise, the gun following his eyes, and squeezed the trigger. Phut, phut. 2 bullets tore into the stainless steel dishwashing counter, inches from Wendy's face. Sparks showered down on her hair. She threw herself flat against the wet floor, covering her head as jagged metal and ceramic dust rained down. Kenji realized his mistake instantly. He swung the gun back toward Joo-hyung, but the rhythm was broken. The distraction had worked, but the cost was high. He now knew exactly where Wendy was. "Missed," Kenji snarled, stepping away from Joo-hyung and turning his full attention toward the dish pit. He began to walk toward Wendy's hiding spot, the gun raised. "You're going to regret dragging this out." Wendy pressed her face into the rubber mat, more her heart hammering against the floor. She was pinned. If she moved, he would see her. If she stayed, he would execute her. And the chemicals she needed were still sitting uncapped at her knees. The dishwashing station was a dead end, a narrow chute of stainless steel flanked by high shelves of drying racks. It was a fatal funnel, and Wendy had backed herself into the deepest corner of it. There was nowhere left to run. She heard Kenji's footsteps stop at the mouth of the corridor. He was taking his time, savoring the checkmate. "You have spirit, Wendy," Kenji called out, his shadow stretching long and distorted against the wet tiles. "But you're just delaying the inevitable. Put your hands up and I'll make it clean. One shot." Wendy didn't respond. She was crouching behind a rolling cart, her hands moving with frantic precision. She grabbed a gray plastic bus tub from the floor. With trembling hands, she unscrewed the cap of the industrial bleach and upended the heavy jug. The clear, thick liquid glugged into the tub, filling it halfway. The smell of chlorine was sharp and nostalgic, the scent of 1,000 nights spent scrubbing floors. She dropped the empty bleach jug and grabbed the yellow bottle of ammonia. She didn't pour it yet. She held it in both hands, uncapped, her thumb pressed over the opening. Kenji rounded the corner. He looked impeccable, even in the harsh light of the dish pit. The suppressor on his pistol looked like a black hole. He spotted her crouching behind the cart and smiled, a genuine expression of professional satisfaction. "No more pots?" he asked softly, raising the gun. Wendy looked him in the eye. She didn't look at the gun. She looked at the narrow space between them, the air he was breathing, the air he was about to share with her. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the last clean air in the room, and held it. Then she dumped the entire bottle of ammonia into the tub of bleach. Before the liquids could settle, she wound her leg back and kicked the tub with everything she had left. The plastic container skidded across the slick, wet tiles, spinning wildly, sloshing the two chemicals together in a violent, frothing mixture. It slammed into Kenji's shins just as the reaction hit critical mass. It wasn't a fire, and it wasn't an explosion. It was a phantom. A dense white cloud of chloramine gas erupted from the tub, hissing like a nest of vipers. It expanded instantly, filling the narrow corridor with a thick, opaque fog. The chemical reaction was aggressive and immediate, eating the oxygen in the hallway. Kenji fired blindly. Phut! Phut! But the bullets sparked harmlessly off the ceiling. He staggered back, coughing, his composure shattering. The gas hit his eyes and throat like acid. It wasn't just a smell, it was a physical assault. He clawed at his neck, his eyes burning as if they had been packed with sand. The assassin who had survived knife fights and shootouts was suddenly drowning in the air. The cloud of white vapor expanded with terrifying speed, rolling over Kenji like a breaking wave. The chemical reaction was violent and immediate. It wasn't just smoke, it was an assault on the biology. Kenji clawed at his face, his polished composure dissolving into animalistic panic. The gas seared his corneas and filled his throat with fire. He turning every breath into a drowning gasp. He staggered backward, blindly swinging the pistol. He couldn't see the floor, the walls, or the woman who had unleashed hell. He pulled the trigger, once, twice, 3 times. Phut, phut, phut. The suppressed shots tore through the kitchen, pinging wildly off the stainless steel hoods and shattering ceramic tiles. One round decimated a stack of dinner plates, sending porcelain shrapnel raining down like hail. Wendy, lungs burning despite holding her breath, scrambled out of the dish pit on her stomach. The air was clearer near the floor, but the fumes were spreading fast. She saw the sparks flying from the ricochets and realized with horror where the bullets were heading. Ju-young was lying in the open, completely exposed behind the prep island, a sitting duck in a shooting gallery. So she didn't hesitate. Wendy launched herself across the gap, sliding over the wet tiles until she collided with Ju-young's rigid body. She didn't try to drag him this time. There was no time. Instead, she sprawled on top of him, pressing her face into his expensive silk tie, covering his head and heart with her own body. Ju-young stared up, his vision filled with Wendy's uniform. He could feel her heart hammering against his chest, a frantic drumbeat of survival. He flinched internally as a bullet slammed into the metal cabinet inches above her head, the impact vibrating through the floor. She squeezed her eyes shut and buried her face in his neck, shielding him from the chaos. In the center of the kitchen, the gunfire stopped. Kenji stumbled out of the white fog, dropping the gun. He fell to his knees, clutching his throat with both hands, his mouth opening and closing in a silent scream. His face was red and swollen, tears streaming from eyes that could no longer see. He tried to crawl toward the exit, his fingers scraping uselessly against the grout, but his lungs had betrayed him. He collapsed forward, his forehead hitting the floor with a wet thud. His body convulsed once, then went still, overcome by the very chemistry he had mocked. Silence returned to the kitchen, broken only by the hiss of the settling gas and the ragged, desperate sound of Wendy gasping for air against Ju-hyung's chest. The king was alive, but only because the pawn had turned herself into a shield. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. It was a suffocating chemical silence, broken only by the hum of the ventilation hood struggling to cycle the poisoned air. Wendy lay on Ju-hyung's chest for a moment longer, counting the beats of his heart against her ribs. It was slow, terrifyingly slow. The neurotoxin was finishing what the bullet hadn't. She scrambled off him, her eyes streaming tears from the lingering fumes. She grabbed Ju-hyung by the collar again, her muscles screaming in protest. "Not yet," she rasped, her voice wrecked by the gas. "You don't get to die yet." She dragged him away from the dish pit, her heels slipping on the wet floor, hauling him toward the vegetable prep station near the back. The air was clearer here. She hoisted his upper body against the base of the sink, propping him up like a broken doll. His head lolled to the side, his eyes half open, glazed and unfocused. He looked gray. Wendy reached up and tore the white first aid box from the wall bracket. It clattered to the floor, spilling bandages and antiseptic packets. She dug through the mess frantically, tossing aside burn cream and Band-Aids until her fingers closed around a yellow plastic tube. An epinephrine auto-injector, standard issue in any kitchen for severe food allergies. It was a stimulant, a shot of pure adrenaline to the heart. It wasn't a cure for a military-grade neurotoxin, but it might jumpstart his system enough to keep him alive. "I don't know if this will kill you," Wendy whispered, gripping the pen, "but you're already dying." She ripped the safety cap off with her teeth. She didn't hesitate. She swung her arm down and drove the needle into Ju-hyung's thigh, right through the fabric of his expensive trousers. Click. She held it there, counting to 10 just like the training poster said, staring into Ju-hyung's vacant eyes. "Come on," she begged. "Come on, wake up." She pulled the pen out and tossed it aside. She turned on the faucet, cupping icy water in her hands and splashing it onto his face, trying to shock him back to the surface. Water dripped from his eyelashes, mingling with the sweat on his pale skin. Nothing happened. Ju-hyung sat motionless, the water soaking his shirt. Wendy slumped back against the cabinet, the adrenaline finally crashing. She buried her face in her hands, a sob catching in her throat. She had done everything. The hiding, the fighting, the chemistry, the dragging. It wasn't enough. She sat there in the quiet, listening to the drip of the faucet, accepting the failure. Then a sound, a tiny rhythmic tap-tap against the tile floor. Wendy lifted her head. She looked at Ju-hyung's hand resting on the wet floor. His index finger twitched, then his thumb. It wasn't a spasm, it was a fist forming. Slowly, painfully, Ju-hyung's hand curled into a ball, white-knuckled and shaking with the effort of returning to the living. The morning sun cut through the haze of blue and red sirens flashing outside the service entrance. The kitchen, once a sanctuary of silence, was now a hive of controlled chaos. Uniformed officers and men in dark suits, Ju-hyung's loyalists, moved through the wreckage, stepping over shattered glass and puddles of chemical slush. Ju-hyung sat on a metal folding chair near the open back door, a paramedic blanket draped over his shoulders. He was pale, his hands still trembling with intermittent tremors, but he was upright. As he held a bottle of water in his hand, staring at it with a mixture of suspicion and profound thirst. Across the room, Wendy stood near the dish pit. She looked small. The adrenaline had evaporated, leaving her shivering in her chemical-stained uniform. 2 officers stood on either side of her, their hands hovering near their belts. To them, she was just a variable, a cleaner found in a locked room with a dead body and a poisoned boss. "Sir," a lead detective said, stepping into Ju-hyung's line of sight. He gestured toward Wendy with a pen. "We're processing the scene. The woman claims she works here, but she has no ID on her. Do you want to press charges for the break-in? Was she an accomplice?" Ju Young looked up. His eyes, though bloodshot and weary, sharpened instantly. He looked at Wendy. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at her scuffed sneakers, accepting her fate. She expected to be discarded. That was the rule of the invisible people. Ju Young stood up. It was a struggle. His legs were like water, and he had to grip the doorframe to steady himself. The movement drew the attention of everyone in the room. The detectives, the loyalists, the paramedics. They all froze, waiting for the king to speak. He shuffled forward, shedding the paramedic blanket. He walked past his lieutenants, past the detective, and stopped directly in front of Wendy. She flinched, looking up at him with wide, exhausted eyes. "She was not an accomplice," Ju Hyung said, his voice raspy but echoing with absolute authority. He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, feeling the tension in her frame. He turned to his men, sweeping his gaze across the room. "Kenji is gone, and the position is open?" He looked back at the detective. "She isn't a suspect. She is my new head of security." A ripple of confusion went through the room. The detective blinked. "Ideally, sir. She's a janitor." "No," Ju Hyung corrected, his grip on her shoulder tightening reassuringly. "She is the only person in this building who saw what I missed." He looked Wendy in the eye, stripping away the rank, the suit, and the arrogance. Slowly, deliberately, Ju Hyung Min lowered his head. It wasn't a nod. It was a bow. A deep, respectful bow to the woman who had dragged him through hell. "Thank you," he whispered, for her ears only. Wendy straightened her spine, taking a breath of fresh morning air. She was invisible no longer.